Okay, hi there. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anthony Martin, and I'd like to go through our mini-series session with you today on fear and confidence. So hopefully that's allowed everyone enough time to get comfortable and get ready to join us in our session today. And let's just go through a couple of quick introductions and a little bit of background info about these sessions. So let's take a quick look at this one. So as I say, my name is Anthony Martin, and I'm the Digital Innovations and Engagement Manager here at Exeter College. And I'm also leading up on our EdTech Demonstrator program as well, and all the support we're offering out to schools and colleges as part of that scheme. Now, part of these sessions, the reason we can do them is basically due to that scheme itself and the funding that's available from that. So at the end of this session, there will be a link to a PID form, which is a quick form you can fill in to tell us a little bit about how we can help and support you. Please do take the time to fill that in for us. We will follow up with everyone on these sessions anyway, but if you could take the time to fill in that particular form, even if the only support you require is just to come along to these sessions and get a little bit of insight or just a little bit of discussion or thought experiments around some of the things we're covering, it is a big help to us to make sure that we can continue to offer these sessions out to people. So hopefully you find what we're about to go through useful. And on the effectively today, as I say, we are covering the fear and confidence aspect of our mini series. If you haven't caught any of our previous sessions, then feel free to get in touch and we'll signpost you to some of the materials we'll be sharing out around those as well. We've also run other sessions on innovation and the adoption lifecycle, digital skills, time and resources. And then coming up later in the series as well, over the next few weeks, we'll be covering communications, as well as some aspects around AI automation and kind of driving efficiencies. Everything we're covering, though, is effectively, hopefully, as you've picked up by now, around digital transformation and the challenges that we face in driving that digital transformation piece. So today in particular, it's fear and confidence. And I just wanted to share with you some of the elements that I'm going to try and cover with you all today. And these are very much sort of thoughts and discussion points. Really, I can't say that I'm qualified in a psychology sort of background, so it's not something to sort of give you the definitive and the scientific sort of answers to things, but it's certainly around experiences that I've had and around some of the kind of challenges that I know that we face and the ways that we've combated and tried to overcome them. So those aspects are around the common fears that we all face in terms of driving change, around framing the problems, so understanding a bit more about them. I'd also like to talk to you about our attitudes to failure and how we embrace that and how we approach failure in particular. In addition to which, I'd like to go through boosting confidence and a very short sort of few tips on that and ways of looking at it. And also then our approaches that we take to change and driving change. And finally, probably the useful part of it is a discussion piece around overcoming those fears. So the fears we pick out, let's look at ways we might be able to start overcoming them as well. Okay, so kickstarting then, what do we mean by fears and confidence, and what do they have, why do they have anything to do with digital transformation at all? Well, fundamentally, it's this. So these fears and confidence aspects that we have, and all of us have those in some way, shape or form, surrounds barriers to adoption, or they create barriers to adoption, which can cause problems and derail projects. It can certainly slow down our digital transformation efforts. So it's really important then that we look at securing buy-in from our colleagues and from our teams and from stakeholders within our institutions to try and combat those barriers. And ultimately, that should hopefully lead to a success or a successful outcome, whether that is on a particular project or whether that is on your entire transformation element. Those are the things that we're trying to achieve. Ultimately, is a successful program. So it's a really important element to consider in your actual digital transformation journey itself. And these are fundamentally, they're human barriers to adoption. They're predominantly around our our thoughts and our feelings and our attitudes towards certain elements. And that's what we're going to look at in the next section around common fears. So when we talk about common fears, these are just a few that I've picked out, and they are predominantly from a kind of teaching and learning perspective as a teacher or a presenter standing at the front of a class. And the first one is about others' perceptions. This is a really, really important one, and it's often overlooked and often dismissed as kind of, I wouldn't say it's unimportant, and I wouldn't say people consider it unimportant, but they can be considered to be trivial in some cases. But actually, there's a very significant backing behind this and why they're important. So when we talk about others' perceptions, the fear that we face really is not understanding the subject necessarily, or having people perceive that you don't understand the subject, that you're not considered a subject expert on a particular area. Is these ideas that students will know more than you. But it's also the idea that you don't want to look daft and you don't want to look like you're making a mistake in front of your class. And it's that embarrassment factor, it's that humiliation sort of risk, I think, that I'm talking about here when we talk about those perceptions. Nobody wants to look silly in front of class, but I think a lot of this, as we'll come on to later, is about how we approach that and how we react to that kind of situation. From a lesson point of view, it can happen that a lesson may not go entirely to plan, and it can be the case that it may work perfectly one time, and it may not work then on a subsequent lesson. Could be delivered in exactly the same way with exactly the same course contents, but that can be a changeable situation. So it's when we talk about things like perceptions here, and we look at, say, for instance, remote delivery that we're doing at the moment. When we're doing those remote delivery sessions, if there's an element where maybe SLT members are going to be jumping onto sessions, or there's an observation element to that there is an increased risk that those sessions will not go to plan for a multitude of different reasons. And that further instills the fear that we have around that particular aspect. The next one, and I can speak from this one from very personal experience from just about 5 minutes ago. So we're talking about reliability. And this can be reliability in a multitude of different things, but predominantly around the technology that we're using. So the laptops, the PCs, the kind of connected equipment that we're trying to use to deliver our sessions. Excuse me just a moment. So when we look at this, my example is a Windows update just literally 5 minutes before trying to deliver this session. Perfect timing. Just finished completed in time, but of course that is a massive technological failure from my point of view. It's something that I would have had to try and overcome, probably scrabbling around to either get a different laptop or a different PC, or log on to another device in some way so that I can carry on and do this session with you. That's just one example. The other ones, of course, could be things like breakout rooms not working the way you expect them, or the tools and techniques you're using not working the way you expect them to. And this can be born from, as I say, unreliable technology. It's about having plans B, C, D, E, and F, as well as your plan A. And also there's a training need here as well around reliability in one, understanding the technologies you're working with, but also then making sure you're confident in using those and you have the opportunity to use them. The third kind of element of fear that is encountered around our change aspects is around complexity. And this is very easy to create some very complex projects and very complex digital transformation aspects. And then from the fear aspect of it, it can be too much to learn or too much to take in a short period of time. We might also think of it as being a lack of knowledge in some areas as well, that people have not yet been trained up in particular areas. So there'll be an increased perception of complexity on those products. That could very easily be resolved by increasing training or increasing CPD opportunities around some of those things. But we do have to be mindful of the challenges around complexity. The next fear factor, and I think this is a really important one at the moment, particularly around the pandemic and lockdown activity we're all having to go through, is this one of change fatigue. So the fear here, or the fears here, really are around things are changing too fast. We're fighting uphill battles, and that's both from on the ground from the classroom side of things, but also throughout our leadership teams across the country in education. Is we're fighting an uphill battle in terms of just getting the right message out there, in terms of driving the right opportunities for learners, and making sure we do the best by them. So there's a lot of fear of getting it wrong, of trying to do things the right way. There's a lack of communication element here as well, or lack of appropriate communications can fuel this change fatigue, and we'll have a look at that in a little bit. And fundamentally, the change that we're trying to drive could be too big. It could be too much at one time, and particularly too much at one time during a pandemic, and that can also present us some fairly significant challenges. This whole concept can be linked to the topics around your strategy and your roadmap elements in particular. It's about your teams knowing what changes are coming and being able to react to that. A lot of the time we say that we're taking on too much, we can't deal with this, it's too much change, or the app is constantly changing, for instance, those sort of elements. But equally, we react to that in our normal day-to-day lives in a much different way. You know, for things like our Facebook and social media tools that we're using are receiving regular app updates. The response we have to that is we just accept it, move on. However, the response we have in a change program, where it's something to do with our work lives, is often a little bit different to that. We react adversely to those changes and the frequency of changes. So there is a mindset piece there as well around understanding why we might treat something one way versus another way in work life. And then this one is this is an age-old problem, and this has existed ever since our species started working fundamentally. So it's the risk of or fear of becoming obsolete. A very real concern, very real fear for people, and this fundamentally lies with things like job security, around ideas of being left behind or not sort of being as up to date as everybody else. But it also has an element of perceived value as well, in terms of how your team members feel valued by your institution in particular. And this is a very fundamental fear, the fear of obsolescence. So we will look at that again in a little bit more detail, and maybe some ways of overcoming that. This particular aspect may be born from things like, if we take an example, for instance, lecture capture was a good example of that obsolescence. You know, if I start recording my sessions, then do I need to be a teacher anymore, or do I have the opportunity to be a teacher anymore? That was a comment that I heard many times kind of before lockdown hit. And now that we've moved and we've transitioned, we've had to start embracing that particular technology. Those conversations aren't happening in quite the same way anymore. There's not really a sense that it has made people feel obsolete. So these aspects aren't necessarily unfounded, but they may require us to adapt and change ourselves in order to overcome them. So next up, I'd like to look at our perspectives on fear and confidence. So how we handle it and how we address how we begin to understand them. So I think really this has to start with our discussion. And if there is a barrier put in the way of a change program we're trying to implement, is to hold discussion, to understand and to find out what it is that is causing that kind of barrier. I think it's important that we do that in an empathetic way, that we understand what it is that is triggering or is causing that fear or that lack of confidence in a certain area, and that we work with those individuals to try and understand how we can overcome it, how can we solve those particular issues. And the way I've taken to looking at this is actually going back to some of our underlying principles, or theorem, I suppose, in terms of how we address that set of needs. Taking Maslow's hierarchy here in terms of hierarchy of needs, hopefully this is one that is pretty much familiar to everybody on this session today, but it does really start to underpin some of those fear aspects. I think all of those fears I've discussed already, we can signpost back and we can pinpoint back to a fundamental need that needs to be addressed on this hierarchy. So the model I've looked at is really around how this model might translate back into those feelings or that sense of identity that our colleagues have. And indeed ourselves as well. It's not just everybody else. This is something that, you know, we're all human. It's going to affect all of us. So at the top of it, it's that self-actualization piece. I am me. It's about me as an individual, me in my autonomy and my control of myself and the kind of empowerment aspects. Coming down a little bit more, it's about how I'm known, leading on to how I'm accepted and understood by others. And then if we take those, the next tier down around safety aspects, it's about feeling safe and feeling probably confident in yourself and in that in your work that you're carrying out. And then fundamentally underneath that, underpinning everything else, is the sense of being comfortable in those basic needs being met. So Maslow looks at these from the terms of sustenance, of food, of warmth, of being able to survive. That's probably not a lot different in terms of how we look at it from a fear point of view. So then my suggestions of how this might map back to what we've just been talking about. At the top level, we're looking at things, and these fears might manifest themselves as maybe a loss of autonomy at the top. So looking at how standardization processes and change routines we're trying to put in might impact that and might make people fearful of that particular change. Next down, we talked right at the start about those class front activities and feeling stupid in front of your learners. It's a humiliation and embarrassment aspect, or the technology won't work. So we're sort of hitting onto that part there. Moving down again then to the next layer, it's around your belonging sense and not feeling like you're acting alone or you're the only person doing something, and also how your colleagues are going to react to that or how they're going to relate to that, and will you still be accepted within that circle in kind of knowing or working in a certain way. Further beneath that again, we're then looking at comfort and in your routine and the knowledge that you have, and it's also around habits. So when we look at that safety elements, you feel safe in the environment where you have the understanding. So you don't necessarily want to venture outside of that comfort zone. Why should you? It's perfectly safe. It's been perfectly acceptable so far. There isn't an inherent need necessarily from your own sort of well-being safety point of view to progress beyond that. Obviously, that's why the other higher tiers exist in this framework. But also within that same section is knowing that somebody has your back as well, that if you do step outside of your comfort zone, that you have something and somebody you can fall back on to support you in that decision or in that change process you're going through. And then finally, at the very bottom of this, again, as we look at those real fundamental issues, and particularly in the world of COVID as well, it's that threat to survival. So realistically in here, we're talking about things like redundancy in job roles in terms of ensuring that you have some way of still putting food on the table at the end of the day. And so that is a very primal, very basic need, but it does drive a lot of the fears behind our reluctances to embrace some of those changes. So there are also things that we do as trainers and mentors and leaders as well around these fears and the way in which we role model or act as role models. And I think some really important points here to understand, and one I'm very mindful of myself, is this easy peasy element. I think it's really important to understand that we may see something as being easy peasy, but it's not necessarily the case of everybody else. We shouldn't necessarily look at something as being so easy that it should just be second nature to people, because actually it's not necessarily in everyone's repertoire, it's not necessarily in everyone's comfort zone. It's also really important to understand that things go wrong as well. As I mentioned right at the start of my presentation, things went wrong. That could have very easily happened in the middle of this session. And actually, I've been half expecting internet outages as well while I'm trying to deliver this session to you all today. So there are things that can and do go wrong. And we're going to come on to in a minute about how we actually embrace that and how we show failures and work with them. So even the pros make mistakes. I've been on many presentations with the product leads and product developers of some very well-known brands of software where they have technical issues with the products that they've designed themselves. So it is very possible that it happens, and I think it's something that we have to strike an understanding and say, yes, those things do happen. Let's learn from it, let's move on, but not to hide away and not to shy away from them. And then finally, this expectation of perfection. I think many of us have that. I certainly am a bit of a perfectionist in my own work, but what is perfect? What is perfect to somebody else? There can be very different things between your view and someone else's. So I think we have to probably strike this expectation for perfection. And certainly at the moment during lockdown on how we're having to work at the moment, that is probably quite important. Okay, so our attitudes to failure. I'm just waiting for the screen to catch up, so do bear with me. This is really important about how we go about working with these failures and actually understanding what is failure fundamentally, because failure is something that drives our fears and drives our lack of confidence. So some questions for you then really or some opportunities. Is failure always a bad thing? I would say probably not. That actually failure can be something that drives innovation. But how can we use that as a learning opportunity then? So when we're driving innovation off the back of a failure, it's taking those learning opportunities and understanding what went wrong the first time and driving it and turning it into something better. Our reaction to those failures, though, is really important in understanding. So how do we react? How does our culture around us, how do our leaders around us, how do our team members react to that failure? It's really important to consider whether this is an element of kind of blame culture, or whether it is seen as a learning opportunity and an opportunity to progress. If you're constantly hit with a stick for something that doesn't go quite so well, you're going to be less inclined to try that change in the future. However, if you are supported and you know that someone has your back, you are going to be more inclined to take those smaller risks, knowing that there is a support mechanism around it, and that will drive you forward, I believe. I like to embrace this idea of fail fast. If things aren't going to work, then fine, that's okay. It's okay for them to not work, but to understand it and set expectations from the outset about what's the possible outcomes could be. And of course, we're always going to draw on our past experiences here as well. If we have always been shot down for something that didn't go quite right, we're not going to try it a second time. We're not going to continue to try that throughout our careers. So past experiences in previous posts, previous roles with previous managers, the way that they've reacted, the culture that we've been a part of will all govern the response that we take as individuals then going forward when we face those same kind of challenges. So talking point here, or a thought point here for everyone really, is to think about our own attitudes to failure and what do we want from those situations, because they will happen. Very much so, they will happen. They can be controlled to a degree, but there will always be an element of things which could be better, things which could be improved, or indeed innovated. And it's just being mindful of that. So the questions then stemming from this are, can you really do everything? Or do you need to trim things back and be a bit more realistic about what you can achieve? Does it have to be perfect? And what is perfect? And whose version of perfect are we talking about? Other aspects are things like, is it really that bad that learners know more than you? And that's something I'm going to look at in a moment or two. And what is the reality from that failure? What is the actual outcome? Is it as bad as you thought it was going to be? And also then finally, what can that failure teach us? So how can we move on from it? How can we use it as a way of making things better? So that kind of concludes that part around our attitudes. I just want to move on now to boosting confidence. And a very short section here, really, as much as I would like to spend a long time on this, but confidence, it's worth understanding, first of all, what that is. And confidence is the belief in your ability to handle a situation successfully. Okay, so how do we get confidence? How do we boost confidence of ourselves and our teams? Probably three key areas, really. It's around practice. It's about being given the opportunity to try things out, to practice, to become familiar with them. On top of that, it's also having then the safety blanket and the encouragement of those around you and being supported in your needs. So again, think back to our base needs on Maslow's hierarchy. It's ensuring that we are meeting those and we are satisfying those basic human needs as well within this, so that we can feel much more confident the way we're working. And then also peer support is critically important in this as well. So a lot of what we do at the college with our sort of own advanced practitioners around digital and teaching is that peer-based support, in knowing there's someone within a faculty that you can call on to get a little bit of insight, to have something from someone who is at your level, not necessarily coming directly from the training bods and myself in innovations, for instance, where we may not necessarily see everything on a day-to-day basis in the same light. And exemplars, and showing that this can be done, that someone else has done it before you, that the case studies are there, and that it has the outcomes and it's worth doing. So those are ways that you can boost people's confidence in kind of any of those activities. Next, I'd like to have a quick look at approaches to change. And I look at this in kind of three different ways we can go about it. And from a confidence point of view, it's just understanding what those three kind of ways of driving change might be. So we've got persuasive, we've got direct, we've got competitive. So persuasive is around this idea of working with people as stakeholders for that change, in involving them in creating the discussion piece, in creating sort of the back and forth. So it's a much more slowly evolving change, I would say, but it is one that meets those critical points of the teams and their discussions and their concerns and their fears. The direct approach probably plows straight on through those fears in some regard. This might be led from maybe governance or sort of government-led directives or changes that are happening at the moment around education, maybe sort of around Ofsted sort of frameworks, those sort of things. So this could be seen as a bit more of a brute forced approach, in that change must happen, and it must happen in a certain way. So it is kind of plowing on through the middle of that, the normal change processes. And then competitive side of things. So, where there are the fears and where there's a confidence issues put in place, maybe at the persuasive side, maybe where a direct approach in plowing through it is not going to gain the support that you would like behind your programs. We can take that onto a much more competitive way and showing the alternative. So build an alternative and show what's possible instead. Okay, so thinking about that, now that we've looked at those key areas, I'm just going to kind of move towards sort of wind up with some of our elements around the fears that we've talked about already. So those are the five we covered right at the start. We've got our others' perceptions, we've got reliability, we've got complexity, we've got change fatigue, and we've obviously got obsolescence right at the end. Now, let's deep dive on those based on some of the things we've covered today and see where they translate. So looking at that, we've got then around others' perceptions. So this is looking at kind of what those fears actually are. Let's drill down and find out what it is that's actually causing us some stumbling blocks. So I think here we have things like confidence, we have things like our attitude towards failure, and we have that risk of embarrassment. Those are the fundamental elements. If we look at reliability, it's maybe around how our tech is letting us down. It's maybe around fear of the unknown. And again, confidence comes to play in reliability there, in understanding those technologies. Complexity, we're looking at perhaps lack of know-how. It might be the scale of the projects we're working on. It might be the expectations where they set too high. It could be the resources we have available to us as well. Is that, do we have sufficient resources to complete this change program? So those kind of fears are the ones that will come to play there. Change fatigue is a very real one. This is the sense of feeling stressed, of overwhelmed. Things are too much. There's too much happening too quickly. And of course, obsolescence stems on those primal, those basic things around job security, around your value within an institution, and around, again, potentially the embarrassment aspect as well. So there are many more. This is just kind of my few examples that I picked out of the deeper dive there. So let's try and overcome them, shall we? Let's sort of move on to that and see how we can overcome some of those fear items. And these again are my thoughts that I have around this. So others' perceptions. What could we do here? I think here really it's around training offering, making sure we have some training to support this. It's around instilling resilience and having people able to handle and to cope with those embarrassing situations, the Windows updates that happen, the PC and the technology failures. Is about having a backup plan and plan B, and it's around mechanisms that you can employ for that. So support, training, mentoring, those are really important. Also, it's okay to fail, I think, in most cases. And it's seen to have those hiccups and those mistakes and so on. And that then is some bearing on how our culture responds to that and how we look at those elements. Next down, we have, again, reliability. So this is really around keeping it simple. Don't try and use every technology in your learning environment. Use the ones you know work, use the ones you know you can support. Don't try and do everything fundamentally. It's very easy to do that, and it's very easy, I would say, for myself as an innovations guy to try and do all of that as well. I know I have to go at the pace that the rest of my teams can work with. And again, training comes into play here as well. It's around being able to overcome those challenges as you face them. So complexity is an interesting one. This moves on to a different level now, really around roadmap, in understanding what it is you're trying to do. What's the picture, so you know where it fits in. We've got then training support elements to this as well, but also potentially providing toolkits or product portfolios that can help people. In terms of change fatigue, there are some very clear runners here in terms of ways you can combat this and overcome it. Strategy is absolutely critically important here. Having a roadmap, having something that people can refer back to, having something that shows that this is where we started, this is where we're going, and these are the steps in between that we're doing, will help your staff members understand and relate to their position. That, you know, they can see what change is happening, they can see that there's perhaps light at the end of the tunnel with those changes, and they can see what it is that's trying to be achieved. That must go hand in hand with really clear communications, I think. Without that, without those two things working together, it's going to look like you're jumping from one thing to another thing, and back and forth, and it's going to disengage people. So I think those two are really important. And then finally, on the point of obsolescence, how can we combat that particular fear? Well, peer-to-peer support, building confidence, explaining and understanding the vision, the values, and the culture of our institutions, but also roles and understanding roles. And I want to pick out those last two, and I'm very conscious of timing, so I will sort of progress on a little bit quickly through these. The two that I want to pick out as key here are others' perceptions and obsolescence. So on others' perceptions, this is around the thoughts of, feeling embarrassed that you don't necessarily know everything in the subjects, feeling that your students know more than you, that it's not going to work in the classroom environment, those particular changes. I'd like to look at that a little bit differently, and I'd be very interested to see what comes out of this change around the exams in education, particularly at the moment, where we're moving a little bit more from a model of what you can remember, i.e. what you can be taught to remember for the exam to make sure you pass the questions, versus the teacher assessment side of things, which is probably more of an element of understanding. So when we're looking at that, I think there are some really important elements starting to come into play here around the mentorship and the difference in approach that maybe blended and remote learning is offering. And I think that opens up some really interesting conversations for the future. On the obsolescence piece, again, some really interesting conversations for the future here, because job roles have always changed. This digital change, this transformation is making us question some of those fundamental underpinning concepts of teaching, I suppose. From the obsolescence piece, if we think lecture capture, the fear was that lecture capture would put us all out of a job and we wouldn't be able to teach anymore because people just watch the video. YouTube's done a lot of that as well. So these things are happening, but they change the way that we work with that. You don't necessarily have to have someone standing there teaching that session or delivering the same presentation when it could be consumed as a blended learning activity. But the extra support that you can then offer, because you're not spending the time doing that, is also critically important. So I think there's a progression, there's an evolution to something that could work in a very different way, but doesn't necessarily mean that roles are going to be made obsolete because of embracing these technologies. So again, some really interesting discussion pieces, I think, there. And then finally, coming on to my takeaways from today's session. So these are some of the things really for you, hopefully, to have a think about or engage with us if you wish to. Takeaways are: find the opportunities for practice and for building confidence. That's really quite an important one. To consider and the appropriate approach to your changes and your change schemes. If it can be kept simple, keep it simple. That will save you an awful lot of bother and overcome a lot of those fears. And how are you going to react to failure? How will you react to your own, and how will you react to those of those around you? What process will you put in place to support and develop from that? And then finally, really do consider the human need behind those fears. What is it, whether you subscribe to the kind of Maslow's hierarchy or not, but what are those kind of base fears saying to you? And what is the fundamental thing that people are concerned is going to happen as a result of that change you're trying to instigate? If you can address the human need, I think you'll be much more successful in overcoming those changes you're trying to drive. And that, I think, is my final word on the matter for today. Thank you very much for listening to me. Apologize if we have overrun a little on timing today. Please do fire any questions over into the chat if you have any. We will hang around for a little bit afterwards to make sure we pick those up. And as I said right at the start of this session, under the PID section there, you can see I've got up on screen. Please do, if you haven't already filled in one of those forms for us, let us have your kind of insights into your organization and the help that you might need as part of this program. And we will do our best to help. If you just want to come along to some of our sessions and you just want to take part in the webinars, you don't need any extra support, that's absolutely fine, but just please fill in one of those PIDs and maybe say that within there. Right, lovely. Thank you all very much. And I'll just move over to questions and answers to see if we have anything popping up at all.